Oregon has been a laboratory of assisted dying. It's been a laboratory of palliative care for the last 15 years, since the Oregon Death with Dignity Act came online in the last few months of 1997. We've learned a lot about what people want at the end of life, and it's not as simple as we anticipated when we went into this experiment. People want knowledge. They want to understand their options, want to be able to weigh the benefits and the burdens of all of their options. Knowledge itself is comfortable. They want comfort. They want the very best of palliative care, and they want some control. These are people, by and large, making requests who have tried very hard to control the circumstances of their lives. They have lived by certain principles. They value the authentic wholeness of their lives, the integrity with which they've lived their lives. They want their death to be a manifestation of those values. They don't want their death to be a negation of those values. We found that knowledge itself is comforting. And really the illuminating discovery was that empowering people with choice itself has a dramatic impact on expanding the level of knowledge that people have at the end of life. It stimulates conversations. Empowered people are not afraid to ask their doctors about what their options might be at the end of life. And that knowledge themselves, whether or not they ever avail themselves of an assisted dying option, that knowledge in and of itself vastly improves the quality of life at the end of their lives and the quality of the communications. Knowledge is also power. We have found that patients who, after a thorough, comprehensive conversation, choose hospice over aggressive treatment often live longer. Quite an astounding revelation that many people who opt for or have aggressive care sort of thrust upon them at the end of life, in fact, die of that aggressive care, and they would have had a longer, better quality life had they turned away from the aggressive, poisonous, torturous treatments and opted for palliative care. So again, even without assisted dying, being the choice that is made, we are witnessing a vast improvement in the quality of life at the end of life. So we've come to think of optimal care and expanded choice as irrevocably linked. We don't really like to talk about one in the absence of another. And we have found that one stimulates the other. Optimal palliative care is absolutely essential. It's essential that, that aid in dying, as we call it, aid in dying, is the option of last resort. People should choose aid in dying because they're in pain that could be ameliorated. And vice versa, palliative care will never be as good as it can be so long as people have certain choices excluded from their comprehensive list of choices. The United States has an evolving policy, and we have assisted dying, aid in dying, legal by various mechanisms in various states. And the work of Compassion and Choices is to push this boundary by whatever legal means is possible. And various jurisdictions make various legal options possible. So the first jurisdiction, of course, was Oregon, whereby Citizens Initiative, that is placing a ballot initiative directly in front of the people for a vote, happened first in 1994, and then followed in Washington in 2008. We'll talk about these other states in a minute. The charge came from our U.S. Supreme Court in a case that was brought by Compassion Choices, saying that it was really an unconstitutional invasion of privacy to have the government intervene in this very personal, private, end-of-life decision-making by a physician and patient. And it was unconstitutional to rob people of dignity. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court disagreed with us, 9-0, we lost. But it wasn't all dark, because the Supreme Court essentially charged the states with working these things out. Saying we're engaged in a challenging task, we're kind of trying to weigh the values of autonomy against the protection of the vulnerable, and the United States it has the advantage of having various jurisdictions where we can try things out and see how they work. So Oregon was the first laboratory of the states. These are the criteria for eligibility in Oregon. It's quite an elaborate process. Mentally competent, terminally adults only, 2 physicians concurring, 3 requests, 2 of them oral, 1 written, some waiting periods, 15 days, then 48 hours, witnesses certifying that there's no duress or influence, mandatory counseling about alternatives. Patient can rescind the request, of course, at any point. 2 physicians involved, both attesting to all of these criteria. One of the things that we learned, and one of the things that our clients, our patients in Oregon and Washington and other places feel very, very passionate about, is that they are not suicidal. They are not committing suicide. Suicide carries, in the United States anyway, an implication of mental illness, an implication that there is a life to live, and for reasons of psychological dysfunction, mental imbalance, a person is turning away from that life to be lived and engaging in self-destructive ideology, suicidal ideology. Our patients don't feel that that typifies them, that doesn't describe them. Our patients would live life if they could. They have no life to live. They are nearing the end of their lives, and the only choice that is available to them is, what is that death going to look like? Will it be peaceful and on their own terms, or will it violate the principles by which they've lived? So we don't use the word suicide when we describe aid and dying in the United States. And as we found, the Gallup organization, who does a lot of polling, it turns out that in 2005 was a crucial poll that really went a long way towards cementing our thinking. But when the question was asked with the suicide word, should doctors be allowed to help their patients commit suicide, the support rate was 58%. When neutral language was used, should doctors be allowed to give a prescription to patients that they could take at a time of their choosing for the medication, the support rate was 75%. That's not a trivial difference. When people hear suicide, it triggers in them a sense that the action is irrational and pathological. Since that time, evidence is gathered, various experts have weighed in on the idea that suicide really is an inaccurate misnomer. Here is the American Psychological Association Working Group has gone on record as saying that it's important to remember the reason on which terminally ill person's judgments are not impaired by mental disorders bases the decision to end his or her life is fundamentally different from the reasoning of a clinically depressed person. So more and more professional organizations are going on record as rejecting the term assisted suicide. American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, American Public Health Association, American Medical Women's Association, and of course the Oregon Department of Human Resources. It's important to understand that assisting a suicide, that is aiding and abetting the self-destructive tendencies of a mentally ill person, is a felony in Oregon. Nothing about the Death with Dignity Act changed that. It's still a felony in Oregon, whether a doctor does it or anyone else. But aid and dying is not assisted suicide, it's a medical practice. So we now have 14 years of experience of aid and dying in Oregon, and this medical procedure is, I would assert, the most studied medical procedure in the history of mankind. We know everything about the people who choose it, how they do it, their families, their reasonings, their diseases, their motivations, their beliefs, their families' motivations, their families' beliefs, the consequences on their family members, the consequences on the physician-patient relationship, the consequences on society, the consequences on palliative care and hospice in the state. Researchers from Oregon Health and Science University, the Veterans Administration, the University of Washington have built their careers on churning one study out after another after another. It's a long, long list. There's nothing that we don't know. Anyone who says, well, it's a big black hole and it's not a transparent system and we don't really know what's going on there in Oregon, doesn't know what they're talking about. There have been 596 people who have ingested life-ending medication in Oregon in the last 14 years. They're almost all white, very, very much weighed in terms of college-educated. They're almost all enrolled in hospice. They're almost all dying of cancer. A few are dying of ALS, which is a motor neuron disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. They're almost all insured. This is one of the most important pieces of data that we didn't necessarily anticipate. And that is that more people, a lot more people, go through the involved eligibility process and obtain either the prescription or actually the medication, the life-ending medication, than take it, than ingest it. People don't want to take the medication. They want to have the medication. It's an insurance policy, a security blanket. They call it their parachute. They hope that they don't ever have to use it. It's like buying insurance, or fire insurance. You don't buy insurance on your house hoping that it would burn down. You buy insurance because in the event that you find yourself in that unfortunate circumstance, you have a way out. You will be made whole. So anywhere from 33% to, in 1 year, 51% of people who went through that elaborate eligibility process didn't even ingest their medication. They died peacefully with palliative care and hospice, knowing they had an option if they needed it. Almost all cancer, that just shows that. Place of death, almost everyone is at home, 93.3% at home. That's where people want to die. They don't want to die in hospital intensive care units. Their end-of-life concerns, almost all are about losing their autonomy, losing the ability to engage in enjoyable activities, losing control of bodily functions, and that includes thinking. People like this are not particularly attracted to the idea of ending life in a coma or a state of delirium. We know that there's no negative effect on family members. Family members seem better prepared for accepting a patient's death than comparable families who don't make use of the Death with Dignity Act. We could go on and on and on and on, citing all of these research studies. I have found it easier in the past few years to just say, look, people, lots and lots of people, lots of objective third-party investigators have looked at the research from Oregon. Don't take my word from it. Look at independent meta-researchers and know that they had no stake in the game. They didn't care how their findings came out for or against success in Oregon, but every single independent look at the Oregon data has concluded that it's a success, that none of the abuses that were anticipated have happened, that palliative care has improved in Oregon, that few people use the end-of-life option of assisted dying, but many, many people derive comfort from it. One of those objective evaluations is the the Government Accounting Office, which is the watchdog arm of Congress. Another is the American Public Health Association. These are the people, the professionals who are responsible for the nation's health. A very, very large organization. They conducted a 2-year study of the Oregon experience, and they ended up passing policy to support legalization of aid in dying. No adverse impact. It is our position now at Compassionate Choices that the Oregon experience as a laboratory has served its function. We know now that aid in dying, legalizing aid in dying does not pose a risk to patients or medical profession. In fact, it's galvanized improvements in end-of-life care. So what do we do when we have a laboratory and we have excellent data? Scientists want to corroborate that data. They want to replicate it. So we have a second state, Washington State, where we have the same exhaustive, extremely exacting data gathering procedure carried on by the state. And the Washington data coming in after 2008 is identical, virtually identical. This is a graph showing the reasons that people choose aid in dying in Oregon, superimposed on the reasons people choose aid in dying in Washington. And so the claims that Oregon is some kind of a funny place where very peculiar people live and that their experience is not transportable has essentially been disproven. So it's our position at Compassionate Choices that it's time to come out of the laboratory. When medical science establishes that a procedure is efficacious, you don't keep You don't keep it in the laboratory over and over again. You import it, you integrate it into medical care. And so that's what's happened in Montana. In December of 2009, the Montana Supreme Court looked at the Oregon data and they looked at Montana state law, and they decided that there was no law in Montana against aid and dying. That the public policy of Montana really encouraged autonomy and encouraged end-of-life decision-making and had laws in place that it did empower people at the end of life, and that there was nothing so radically different about aid and dying that it didn't fall under that umbrella of autonomy and empowerment at the end of life, and so it's not illegal. That case was called Baxter versus Montana. And ever since then, people in Montana who meet these criteria, an adult, mentally competent, who must initiate the request, be a resident of Montana, terminally ill, and self-administering, capable of self-administering medication, can get life-ending medication from their physician. The thing about Montana that is liberating is that it doesn't have the intense state scrutiny where the state is empowered and compelled, in fact, to essentially be sitting on the physician's shoulder watching every single aspect of this process. In Montana, it's assumed to be a legitimate medical practice. It is governed by the regulatory mechanisms that govern every end-of-life practice, every end-of-life decision, subject to best practices, best medical practices, and the regulation of the profession itself. I wanted to show you these polls, and you alluded to them. The takeaway I want to give you from these polls is that the support in the UK for aid and dying, that is allowing a physician to prescribe life-ending medication to a mentally competent terminally ill person, is much higher than it is in the US. Much higher. In Canada and the UK, it's 86 and 84%. In the United States, it's 69%. And how the support plummets when you expand that criteria outside of terminal illness. People with chronic illness or mental illness. The support for giving those people access to a life-ending medication drops precipitously in all three countries, Canada, the US, and the UK. This is what we consider to be a false view of aid and dying. We don't want aid and dying to stick out like a zebra in a herd of horses. It is not so very different from every other end-of-life decision, and it's our goal to change it to that. Thank you.